Diana had been pronounced dead.
If there was no money in the photographs, they wouldn't have been after.
I've just never seen anything like it.
You've lost a lovely person for nothing.
The royal family had failed Diana.
She needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic.
The public did not like this.
Are you really so proud of yourself?
When I saw it for the first time, I was just genuinely shocked.
Nobody addresses the Queen of England in that way. Nobody.
To get Diana to the point where she was when she got in that car crash, all circle back to the royal family. Hi guys, and welcome to my YouTube channel. This is my first for YouTube content that's going to be exclusively available on just this platform. So I'm very excited, I'm glad you're here. A lot of you guys are probably coming over from TikTok. If you're not, please check me out over there as well. I have the same exact username. To start off my first long form history video, I wanna talk about a historical figure that's close to my heart and the hearts of millions, Princess Diana. I'm gonna be specifically sourcing from the documentary Diana, 7 Days That Shook the World, because it is very comprehensive and it's also fully available on YouTube. So if you watch this video and you're like, I need more, definitely check it out. I'll link it down below. Any other sources that I cite, I will also have linked down below. It all started on Sunday, August 31st, 1997, just after midnight. Diana, her boyfriend, and her driver had gotten into a terrible crash. Unfortunately, the driver, as well as her boyfriend, were dead on the scene. Diana was quickly rushed to a hospital where they performed emergency surgery, but it was unsuccessful and she ended up dying. When Diana got into the crash, what had ended up happening and ultimately killed her was that a very key vein in her lungs had been severed, and so she was hemorrhaging out. The French protocol is to act on the scene before taking someone to the hospital. The British protocol is to prioritize taking somebody to the hospital before you act. So there is always going to be a sort of tension about who's right and who's wrong. Meanwhile, the Queen, Charles, and William and Harry were all in Scotland. So at 12:55 in the middle of the night, the Queen was notified about what had happened. The Queen's initial reaction when she found out what had happened to Diana was that she said, "Oh no, someone must have greased the brakes." Charles was devastated. And he had a sort of an extra layer to his devastation than anybody else. Not only is this the mother of his children, and he knew this was going to be deeply painful for his boys, he knew because of how enigmatic Diana was and how many people identified with her and how many people were just angry at him in general, he felt that he specifically was going to be the one who was blamed for her death. The Queen was not of that mind. Nobody else really on the staff shared that same sentiment, but Charles was actually on the money. By 3 a.m., Diana had been pronounced dead. Charles was told first of the death status. When Charles said that he wanted to be the one to go receive Diana's body, the Queen was adamantly saying no. She basically was like, that's really weird. That's your ex-wife. No one's expecting you to do that. Charles was like, that is not true. People are absolutely expecting me to do that. This is an atrocious PR move and we will suffer if we do not do this the right way. At 3:30, Diana's family was notified, the Spencers, and at 4, the United Kingdom was notified.
Sorry to have to be the one to tell you this, but Diana, the Princess of Wales, has died.
There was actually power surges and breakers were going out all over just because so many people had the exact same idea. So many people were turning on TVs, radios, and kettles at the same time.
The shock for all of us, every single person in this country, will be immense.
It's a very British sentiment to be like, oh my God, something's happening. It's the middle of the night. We're freaking out. We need to have a pot of tea ready. Charles and the Queen had decided that it was not necessary to wake the boys in the middle of the night simply because they thought that that would be more jarring and traumatic to wake them up and tell them about what had happened. So they waited until about 7:15 when the boys were normally woken up to let them know. At 5:25 a.m., the royals released a brief statement which goes as follows.
The Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply shocked and distressed by this terrible news.
Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, was actually the first person to make a public statement to the press, and they were exactly who he blamed. He really came at them. He was at his home in South Africa, and he basically said this would never have happened if you guys had listened to her.
This is not a time for recriminations, but for sadness.
However, I would say that I always believed the press would kill her.
The anecdote about her relationship with her brother at the time is they had actually been beefing at the time of her death. They had had this argument because she had asked to go out to his estate so that she could get away from the press specifically. She was being harassed, especially after the divorce. Once she was dating again and she was out there, people were doing the absolute most to try and get pictures of her. And so she asked if she can go to their ancestral home and kind of get away from it all. And he said no. In his mind, he thought, the press is just going to pack up everything that they have in London and move it out here, and it's just going to like completely cause way more turmoil because we don't have the kind of infrastructure to support that influx of people. Although he is probably right, they probably would have just harassed Diana at a different location. He'll always live with the guilt that maybe if he had done that, things would have been a little different. At 10:20 a.m., Tony Blair was like, I need to speak. He knew that as someone who has only been in office for a couple months, if he handled this poorly, it could be a real career ender for him. But more than that, he also cared about Diana. He also was somebody who had participated in just the global rapture surrounding her.
I feel like everyone else in this country today, utterly devastated. The people everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her, they regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain in our hearts and in our memories forever.
Tony Blair's press release, in contrast to the royals' official statement, seemed much more heartfelt and genuine, and people responded to it very positively. This was a huge moment for him as a person, as a figure, and also as a British citizen. At this time, the national attitude was just general fury at the media. Everybody pretty much perceived this crash to have been a result of paparazzi not leaving Diana alone and not letting her have the peace that she deserved. And because there was such sort of feeding frenzy about her, she was the most photographed woman in the world at that time. People just were like, yeah, obviously, like, ultimately the press killed her. It had long been established that the royal family seemed to be jealous of Diana and her magnetic nature, the way that she could so effortlessly and charismatically engage with those around her. The thing that had given her such notoriety and let people feel like they really know her and really just given her this amazing cultural impact was ultimately the thing that led to her demise. The royal family made a lot of moves the week after Diana died that were very unpopular and painted them very negatively in the public eye, and the first of those moves was the decision to still go to church, and more importantly, bring the boys to church that Sunday. That was a deeply unpopular choice. The royal family felt that it was just them reestablishing a sense of normalcy. The public did not like this. This was the first time they were seeing them since Diana's death had been announced. And really the overall reaction was like, how can you be dragging these poor boys to church right now? They were 15 and 12 respectively, and people just felt that it was sort of insensitive. They had only had a couple hours to come to terms with the fact that their mother had just died, and making them go to a public service just wasn't really the move. The Queen had specifically requested that Diana's death and Diana in general not be mentioned in the service, which people at the time just kind of connected that back to the whole the royals are jealous of Diana thing, when really the Queen had done that because she was concerned that it would just be deeply triggering for the boys, and she was trying to avoid any sort of public meltdown and really just she was being a grandmother. She was trying to preserve them in that way. At noon that day, Britain as a collective had a moment of silence for Diana. By September 1st, 1997, there was 6,000 people queuing outside the palace every hour to pay respects to Diana. And by September 3rd, it was the biggest demonstration of public grief in British history. The palace had decided to put out books of condolences so that the British citizens could put into words what they were feeling about the loss of Diana. And by the 3rd, those queues for those books of condolences were 11 hours long. And the field of flowers that people had laid down at the castle gates were 50 feet deep. This was not some sort of like virtue signaling, like, oh, I want to be seen out there mourning Diana. Like, people legitimately were in mourning. There was a record increase in church attendances that week. There was a notable increase in calls to suicide hotlines. All this time, the aggression towards the media and the press had just been mounting. The British citizens were furious. They were livid. They felt that it is 100% the press's fault. And there was actually major hostility towards journalists in person at that time. Anyone who was trying to report on the mass grieving was being met with severe hostility, to the point where people were getting very concerned for their safety purely because of their occupation. The dynamic of the crowd had become deeply aggressive by 10 a.m. They were like, you're the reason that she's dead. And hostilities really grew to the point where most journalists ended up leaving. A specific qualm that people had with how the press interacted with Diana is, although initially they had been sweet and just wanting to get a moment of her time and a picture of her, it quickly turned very sour, and they started saying mean things to her. They would call her just different insults to try and get a reaction, because they felt that a photo of her crying, or of her really angry, or even of her just doing something aggressive was way more marketable. Now, much like in life, people were still obsessed with Diana in death. When her body was in the hospital, people were on rooftops, people were flying planes and helicopters by, trying to get a picture. Her staff, specifically her former butler, started covering up the windows with blankets. The room was notably very, very hot, and covering up the windows with blankets just made it all the hotter. And people were really worried that that would affect her body's decomposition. And so her butler came and he brought in a ton of fans. Now, in the background of all of this, they had been trying to decide, how are they going to get Diana home? Because she crashed in Paris, she did not crash in Britain. So they were trying to decide what's the best way to go about this. And since her and Charles were divorced, the royal opinion was that it's inappropriate for him to be the one to go receive her. But he was adamant that it be him. She's the mother of his children. It's his responsibility to go and receive her. At 4 o'clock that day, Charles, alongside Diana's sisters, flew to Paris to go and retrieve her body. At 6:52, the plane holding Diana's body landed officially back in London. When Diana's body was returned to London, people who saw the hearse going by literally got out of their cars by the thousands and stood on the side of the road to pay their respects. That is the impact that this woman had. On September 4th, 1997, the press decided that they needed to redirect this heat off themselves, and that's when they started publicly blaming the Queen. They channeled all of that national outrage and frustration and just directed it at the royals. And it was an easy stone to throw, because they weren't even in residence at the palace, which a lot of people were feeling disrespected by. They felt that their grief was being ignored. They felt that they were being sidelined, and that was just reminiscent to them of how Diana had always been sidelined by the royal family. The palace has one flagpole in the center towards the front, and typically when the Queen is in residence, they fly the royal sigil so that people know that she's there. It's really more of like a I'm home, I'm not home kind of thing. And they had never flown the country's flag in that flagpole. It was specifically reserved for the royal sigil. And people were not happy. All across the UK and in many parts of the world, the country flags were at half-mast. And when people looked at that flagpole and they looked at that 50-foot deep pool of flowers, and they just saw that there was no flag there at all, it infuriated people. They felt that it was a deep, deep disrespect. For many, it came to represent royal callousness, which really just fed the fire that was already kind of brewing towards the royal family, where people felt like the root of all of the things that have transpired to get Diana to the point where she was when she got in that car crash all circle back to the royal family. It is all their fault. If they had just not been so callous, none of this would have happened. And when they looked at that flagpole and they didn't see a flag, it represented the emotionlessness of the royal family. The press saw this moment of weakness and they absolutely pounced. Within just a few hours, 42,000 plus people wrote The Sun, which is sort of like the New York Times of the UK, and demanded that the flag be put at half-mast. And the Queen still was adamantly refusing, no matter how many aides and advisors told her that it was simply what needed to be done. There was genuine concern that riots might break out. Interestingly, the thing that people really respect about Elizabeth is that she has always put her country before her family, and she has never been somebody who's very emotional and very impulsive. People felt like she didn't put family first, and that's why everything with Diana happened, because the family's so callous. But in the reality, like, this was one moment where she actually was putting family first, because she was not trying to play politics. She was focused on William and Harry, and that's why she was kind of ignoring the flag thing. The situation got so intense that Charles was actually really concerned that he was gonna get assassinated. He kept trying to tell Queen Elizabeth, this situation is so much more of a PR nightmare than I feel like you're realizing. I know you're focused on the boys, I care about the boys too, but we have to secure their legacy, and if we don't do something, we are literally going to be killed. The Queen finally really realized the severity of the situation, and she agreed to, for the first time in royal history, fly the country's flag and have it at half-mast. To sort of test the vibe, the family sent out 2 members to just walk amongst the crowd at 6 on Thursday, just to see how they were received. Actually, it was sort of like a huge sigh of relief. When the public saw that members of the royal family were out and they were looking at the flowers and they were interacting, all they really wanted to do was be like, oh my gosh, hey, I'm so sorry about what happened. Like, we are all so devastated over this. And it kind of reminded people, like, this is a royal family, yes, but ultimately it is still a group of people who have lost somebody who was an integral piece of that family. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the royals and the Spencers, Diana's biological family, were not in agreement on basically anything that had to do with the funeral plans. The guilt that Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, had felt over the way that she died was definitely coloring the way that he was interacting with the royal family. He felt that he had failed to protect his sister in the moment that she needed him most, and because of that, he was doing everything that he could to try and make sure that things were going the way that he felt Diana would want them to go. Because he knew the way his sister felt about the royal family and about Charles specifically, he did not want Charles walking behind the coffin, something that Charles had been insisting upon. He felt that he should walk behind the coffin and that the boys could walk behind the coffin as well. Meanwhile, Prince William didn't want to walk behind the coffin at all, which pretty much everybody disagreed with. Both families really wanted William and Harry, but especially William, to walk behind the coffin, and felt that it was a key part in him showing strength, basically, which is really unfortunate. I mean, he was only 15, and having to think like through the lens of political longevity when you're grieving your mother and you're still going through puberty, like you haven't even accepted this fully adult role yet, is asking a lot. That Friday at 11 a.m., the royal family finally returned to London. And in yet another breach of tradition, the boys were allowed to fly on the same plane. Now, typically, if there's 2 expectant princes, they're never allowed to fly on the same plane at the same time, because if something were to happen, they need that spare, and Harry's the spare. And so normally Harry and William were never on a plane at the same time. But they both really wanted to be with their father, and no one was going to say like, hey, one of you has to sit alone. Once the boys were in London, they asked if they could go see all of the flowers, because some of the staff had told them that there were all these flowers. Now, Queen Elizabeth had been so worried about how the boys were going to react to their mother's death that she had actually demanded that all TVs and radios be removed from Balmoral, which is where they're staying in Scotland, so that the boys would not see anything distasteful about their mother. They didn't really have any idea how intense the public grieving of Diana was until they went and they saw those flowers. And the royal family was nervous about letting them do it, but they also understood that this was a moment that needed to happen. They needed to see how loved their mother truly was. The Queen and Charles also wanted to go and see the flowers because they didn't want the boys to go by themselves, although of course they had security and everything else. They just wanted to be there for moral support. But the Queen was deeply concerned after seeing the outrage that had been building for the last several days about how she would be received. And when she and Charles stepped out of the car, the crowd was completely silent, which is normally something that would never happen. When you see the Queen, you clap. And so that was the first indication to them, like, yeah, people are really serious. So that is, Elizabeth went over to the crowd.
And she came over and asked me if she wanted me to go and put them down with all the rest of the flowers. And I said, no, they're for you, Mum. Held my hand at this point. She was shaking and she sort of questioned me, like, are you sure? And I was like, I think you deserve them. I think you've done the right thing staying with your grandsons. I think I actually said, you know, if my mum had just died, I'd want my grandma with me.
And that moment really touched Elizabeth. Like, you could visibly see that she actually was emotional about it, which is something that normally she would never let the public see. And so that just indicates to me how deeply moved she really was. She felt like okay, people do understand that this is actually hard for our family as well. Additionally, the Queen broke from tradition in yet another way. For the first time in 50 years, she agreed to do a live broadcast and address the country, because she knew, once she had kind of gotten the clarity of the situation, that if they lost the favor of the people, it was all over for them. That was the only thing that they had. That is the only reason why they are still in the position that they're in today. This was a real make or break moment for her. She knew that this was a deeply important moment, both for her grandchildren to see how she was going to navigate this, but also for the global audience as a whole. People were feeling a lot of emotions at that time, and they hadn't heard from her yet, not really. And so she wanted to make sure that she did it right.
Sunday's dreadful news. We have seen throughout Britain and around the world an overwhelming expression of sadness at Diana's death. We have all been trying in our different ways to cope. So what I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her 2 boys. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death. I hope that tomorrow we can all, wherever we are, join in expressing our grief at Diana's loss and gratitude for her all too short life.
After people saw that, they felt that that was really authentic, and actually for Queen Elizabeth, that was a lot of emotion. People felt that it was very candid, and it was truly a reflection of how she felt. The royal family has protocols for when a family member dies. They usually plan it out years in advance, but Diana was so young that there had been no plans in place in the event of her death, because just nobody was expecting her to die. So they only had 5 days to prepare this funeral, and knew that every single minute detail of this funeral was going to be picked apart to pieces, not just in the moment, but for years and years and years to come. Funeral plans were starting to come together, and they had decided that they should quadruple the length of the procession. So many people pouring into London that they wanted to give everybody the opportunity to see the funeral procession go by, and it just would not have been possible if they did not make it significantly longer. It was actually twice as long as Churchill's funeral procession. But not only that, it was a huge security concern. The police felt that there was no way that they had enough people to handle the influx of people who were going to be coming to this funeral, because so many people have been pouring into London just to pay their respects and leave flowers and write in the condolences books, that they were estimating about a 2 million increase in the population of just London on the day of the funeral. And they had to fly, bus, and train in other police officers from other areas because they simply did not have the manpower. This funeral was the biggest security operation ever seen in British history. That night, 30,000 people actually camped out on the streets in preparation for the funeral proceedings. They had set up all over town giant screens so that people could see the funeral broadcast live in various parks and all over, so that really it felt like it was something everyone could experience together. Even the newspaper printed the hymns that would be sung in church at the funeral out for the public so that everybody could sing along and everybody could participate, because there was this understanding that people felt like they really knew Diana. Diana's mother actually infiltrated those crowds, and she walked through and she listened to everybody crying and all the wonderful things people were saying about her daughter, and really just got to see firsthand how much Diana had touched so many people. And she said it brought her great comfort. That night, Diana's butler actually watched over her body in preparation for the funeral, and he decided that he should hold an all-night vigil. And he set up some candles and some flowers, and he made sure that it was nice for her. He really did what he would have done for her were she alive, because he knew what she liked and he knew what made her comfortable. And he said that he just sat there all night and he talked to her, and he told her about everything that was going on outside, all of the flowers, all of the condolences people had sent, and how much people really truly cared because he knew that she would want to hear it. Only 2,000 guests were officially invited to the funeral service at Westminster Abbey, and it was of course an all-star affair because Diana was both popular in the political sphere as well as just general media. She had a lot of different celebrity contacts and friends who she held dear. They had actually deemed all of London to be a no-fly zone because they didn't want there to be any distractions. They wanted people to truly be able to focus on what was happening. It was actually the biggest global audience in TV history. On September 6th, the funeral was finally held. At 9:08 a.m., the procession started, and immediately people were just wailing. It was a distinctive moment where people first noticed the wreath from the boys and the handwritten note that said "Mummy." And it said that in that moment, people were so quiet that even the birds didn't make any noise. This is when Elizabeth once again broke protocol. She had not cleared this with anybody. She had not let anyone know that she wanted to do this, but she simply stepped outside of the palace into the public, and people were shocked. Her security team was nervous, and as the procession passed her, she bowed to Diana, something that a queen would never do. And it was a great show of respect. During the procession, Diana's brother, Charles, and the boys walked behind the coffin, as well as 553 workers from all of Diana's charities. During the funeral itself, the press had agreed not to film the Spencers or the royal family, just out of respect. But when Diana's now deceased boyfriend's family walked in, there was an audible gasp and a sense of embarrassment, because in that moment, people remembered for sort of the first time that their son had died too. What happened next is something that is such a fascinating cultural phenomenon to me, just something that is so surreal that it's actually the real reason that I decided to make this video, because I've just never seen anything like it. And when I saw it for the first time, I was just genuinely shocked. I was like, that's something that I don't know if that'll ever happen again. And what I'm referring to is when Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, made his speech. No one had pre-approved his speech or even read it because they assumed it would just be a typical scripted eulogy. I'll show a bit of his speech here.
She talked endlessly of getting away from England, mainly because of the treatment that she received at the hands of the newspapers. I don't think she ever understood why her genuinely good intentions were sneered at by the media. For all the status, the glamour, the applause, Diana remained throughout a very insecure person at heart, almost childlike in her desire to do good for others, so she could release herself from deep feelings of unworthiness. The world sensed this part of her character and cherished her for her vulnerability, whilst admiring her for her honesty.
The bottom line, really the dagger sharp bottom line of his speech, was that the royal family had failed Diana, and that he believed that they were unfit to raise the boys.
Who proved in the last year that she needed no royal title to continue to generate her particular brand of magic.
He basically looked over, to a pew full of his in-laws and had a go at them.
She would want us today to pledge ourselves to protecting her beloved boys, William and Harry, from a similar fate. And I do this here, Diana, on your behalf. We will not allow them to suffer the anguish that used regularly to drive you to tearful despair. I pledge that we, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you are steering these two exceptional young men, so that their souls are not simply immersed by duty and tradition.
Though nobody was filming Elizabeth at this time, the staff's reaction, even to this day, is one of sheer disgust.
Look at the Queen. The Queen's horrified.
They were furious that that had been said, especially directly to the Queen's face. If that had happened just like a little bit ago, like a little bit in the past, that's something you would have definitely been beheaded for.
Nobody addresses the Queen of England in that way. Nobody.
People were genuinely shocked. The staff was furious. They felt like that was completely insensitive and inappropriate. At that moment, something so unbelievable and just basically spectacular happened that I just don't think will happen again, at least not for a long time.
We just sat and took it in. And then the sound came. That wonderful sound like the sea.
The world began to clap.
I didn't realize it was people clapping outside. It sounded like pebbles rattling on the roof of the Abbey.
Something that is so surreal that it's actually the real reason that I decided to make this video, because I've just never seen anything like it. And when I saw it for the first time, I was just genuinely shocked. I just want to briefly touch on how Diana had such this amazing energy to her and why people identify with her so deeply. Diana was somebody who was wealthy and beautiful, and in many ways those are things that people have a hard time being sympathetic to. People are like, you're living the dream. But when people saw her, they really saw into her in many ways. She was somebody who had a difficult childhood. She was somebody who struggled with their self-image in spite of being beautiful. And she was somebody who, even though the world embraced and loved her, she was ultimately still rejected by her inner circle. And she really did exemplify the fact that it doesn't matter how many people love you. If the people who you desperately want and need to love you reject you, you will feel unloved. You will. And it doesn't matter how beautiful you are and what a sparkling image you have to everybody else, where people are like, she's so photogenic, literally everything she does is amazing. If you don't see yourself that way, it doesn't matter. And that's really where all of her problems came from. She was somebody who truly was a living example of being inside of a gilded cage. And people knew that because she was open about that. And that's ultimately the reason why people identified with her so heavily. The royal family was never open about how they felt. Never open about what was going on, what it was like, because in their eyes, they were like, we're deeply privileged, we don't have anything to complain about, no one wants to hear from us. But Diana's a walking example that that's not true. People will identify with you if you're honest about what you're experiencing. And Diana was just that. She was somebody who was a deeply empathetic person, somebody who really put kindness at the forefront of her personality. And more than that, she was one of the first public figures to really utilize political spin. And I don't mean that in terms of her being manipulative or disingenuous. She genuinely did care for all of these people, and she genuinely did have a huge heart, but she also recognized the impact of media, and she made sure that when she was doing these wonderful things, there were the right people there who were ready to write about it in the right way. And because of that, people got to really see everything that she was doing. It wasn't the kind of thing where she was quietly philanthropic in the background. No. It was her main thing. And especially because of her work with AIDS, people just felt like they could really identify with her. She went to the hospital and she met with people who were suffering from AIDS. There was a huge stigma against AIDS at that time, and people didn't even want to touch people who had AIDS. They were treating it almost like leprosy. And Diana went to the hospital and she held the hands of these AIDS victims and she hugged them. And when people saw that, it did a huge amount of work for destigmatizing AIDS. Being friends with people who were openly gay, that did a lot of work for destigmatizing homosexuality. She did a lot of things like that. She was somebody who always felt like she was on the outside, and therefore if she saw any group of people who were being pushed to the side, she felt like those were her people. She was like, that's me, you're me and I'm you. And she was ready to advocate for those people.
Diana explained to me once that it was her innermost feelings of suffering that made it possible for her to connect with her constituency of the rejected.
The real tragedy of Princess Diana is that She was such a magnetic person that people just wanted any little piece of her that they could have. And it didn't matter how they got that piece.
Of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this. A girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age.